much appreciate Bhai's comments. One thing, of course, having spent some time with Ranjit now, I've noticed that very often people place these giant cultural burdens on his shoulders. Because he has this extraordinary capacity. People are constantly saying, rescue this part of our culture, rescue that part of our culture. The remarkable thing, Ranjit, is really how much you've done of that in the last few years. It's really quite amazing how we'll trace some of it. But what I liked very much about Bhai's comments was this very sincere phrase that he used about the roadmap to appreciation. I think that's exactly right. That is precisely what one of the things that Ranjit has achieved in this really magnificent book is he's taken a very difficult character, a very difficult personality. I hope over some time we will get some personal anecdotes also from Ranjit. I met him a few times myself growing up, as most Goans in Bombay did. Very difficult man, very complicated man. Difficult is the wrong word actually, let's just say complicated. He was complicated and he was perceived in so many different ways by so many different people. But what you have done in your book is reposition him, even for people who knew him and even knew him intimately, in a way that you can understand and appreciate the contours and trajectory of his life. It's really a remarkable achievement. I look forward to talking about that with you. But I wanted to start quickly by mentioning the landmark that this book launch is. It is a major event because it is Ranjit Hoskote who is releasing a book on Moraes, and this connection, the Konkani connection, is deeply significant. But it's also significant because we are having, as Bhai pointed out, we are having the international launch of a very significant book which will be produced which will be printed in England. We're having it here in Goa. This is a change, and it's a change which is part of a parcel of a number of changes that are taking place in Goa now, which we must appreciate. I'd like to say two things about this. One is that in some ways Ranjit helped to kick this off. I'm sorry, I'm going to be embarrassingly fulsome in my comments, but this is completely sincere. Ranjit helped to kick this off with Aparanta, which is a major art show, which also had literary components, which had a number of different aspects to it, which was a new kind of benchmark way of appreciating, understanding, projecting our culture, and that was entirely Ranjit's job, and it's something that we're deeply appreciative of. But also here I would like to thank Nandini Sahai. We often in Goa tend to be very nativist about who projects, promotes, develops our culture. But here we have this outsider, if you wouldn't mind me saying so, Nandini, who has now over the course of the last 2 or 3 years done something really marvelous for our culture. And she has delivered treat after treat after treat to us. This is in the third month, Ranjit is the latest bouquet that has been offered to Goa by Nandini and by the ICG. Last month we had Anjum Hassan. The month before that we had Jerry Pinto also releasing a very important book for us, for Goans. And this is a wonderful change. We're having these kinds of literary events here. We're having culture. Culture seems to be alive, and it's something that's deeply significant. And I think one big reason for that is the active role that the ICG has started to play in the last couple of years. So I'd like to please ask for a round of applause for that. Finally, Bhai and I are both members of the Goa Writers Group. You may look this group up. It is a vibrant, active, volunteer group here. We're quite proud of it. It does a number of different activities. If any of you are interested in joining the group, please look it up on the internet and feel free to join. We have different activities with a whole range of different purposes, and I hope that all of you will support us. Now to the book. The thing about this book, which I'll describe to you just for a minute or two, it's singular for a number of reasons. First of all, Moraes is heavily published, right? We've all seen Moraes' collected poems, his collected prose, different bits of this he's been written about before. Yet, Ranjit chose to look at Moraes' work again, and what he's managed to do here, this is effectively a heavily annotated critical edition. So, first Ranjit has chosen selected poems, his own personal selection of poems of Moraes' work across the entire span of Moraes' career, and he's basically curated, startling examples which trace a narrative. But what he's done here is something that's unique in the history, I think, Ranjit may be able to correct me here, in the history of literary criticism in India, is that he's done a critical edition with long footnotes to each poem and explaining and understanding the imagery, which I think that is a deeply significant thing. I cannot think of another Indian poet in English for whom the work like this has been done. But the real achievement in many ways here is the introduction. And this is really, this is something which it's magisterial, it's deeply impressive. Ranjit has completely resituated, repositioned, reanalyzed Moraes. Looked at his life, looked at the contours of his creative kind of output, underpinned it in a very concrete way to events in his life, and then he's resituated Moraes himself, as this transcultural artist, which is what Bhai was talking about. Highly innovative approach to Moraes, but also something with tremendous implication for the way we understand ourselves here in Goa, this culture, and our own cultural kind of strand, which has developed in a kind of a transcultural manner. I was hoping, Ranjit, that you would do some readings, and I'm going to stop talking very soon. But first, I just wanted to ask you quickly, why this form of the critical annotated edition? And also, if you wouldn't mind explaining, why Moraes?
Well, let me begin by actually thanking all of you. I, Nandini, Vivek, and all of you who've taken the time and trouble to be here this evening. As Vivek knows, it's always an emotionally fraught experience for me to come back to Goa. Not only because of the old family connections which go back to the mid-16th century, but also because I spent the first 7 years of my life here. So it's never a case of coming to Goa, it's always coming back in different ways that are personal and ancestral at the same time. Having said that, each return to Goa is, for me, very nourishing and marvelous. And even these experiments that I've had the privilege of participating in, such as Aparanta, I do want to say that it's been a privilege because it was always a collaboration with colleagues based in Goa, or who, like Vivek, came back to Goa and joined in this larger cultural ferment in this state. So as I say, in some ways, even what we did together in Aparanta, for me, it was a collaboration. It was an intellectual and a cultural adventure. So this evening and this occasion is for me a continuation of that whole spirit of engagement. But now to answer your questions, why the form of the annotated critical edition? Because I honestly saw that as an astonishing and tragic absence. There's a great deal of cultural infrastructure that is missing in our literature. And when I say literature now, I'm not speaking only of Anglophone poetry in India. I'm speaking of Indian literature across languages. There is a great deal of futile debate about the privilege of one language over another, or one form over another. But there's a lot of very painful, unglamorous, invisible labor, intellectual labor, that simply doesn't get put into how we carry on these literatures. Because in our debate, it is abstract forms that dominate. People like to talk about the grandeur of poetry or the importance of one language or another. But how are we actually going to sustain the importance of any literature if we don't revisit it, so to speak, editorially, if we don't reread it as a very serious act? And it just occurred to me that, when I look back at my own reading, or any of us look back at our own readings, whether it's Yeats or Eliot or who else, any of the great poets that one thinks of, or Rilke, they are available to us in a variety of editions. You have selected poems, you have collected poems, and typically you have a critical annotated edition. Because whilst poetry is perennial, and it lasts forever and it intrigues you, its contexts disappear. The life of the poet drops out of view. So whilst it's interesting to debate the meanings of poetry, there is a certain experience of the poem in its original context which you can't recapture unless you go out and, as you said, retrieve it, curate it in some sense. And it struck me that, shockingly, I can only think of one annotated critical edition for any poet in India. That's William Radice's absolutely monumental work on Tagore. It's Tagore, in translation, a selected body of selected poems with an introduction and annotations. So, on the one hand, we have this rich poetry scene. On the other hand, a gesture like this is missing. So to me it was, as in many of these intellectual adventures that I get into, I didn't sort of sit down one fine day and say, now let me do this. It just struck me as a lacuna, that it was necessary. And that brings me to why Dom. He was, to me, a mentor figure, an important figure. I've always been fascinated by his poetry. And he also is a figure who was somehow buried under an avalanche of cliches about the man, the serial marriages, the alcoholism, the so-called bohemian lifestyle. If you ask anyone what it is that they associate with Dom, unfortunately, it's the stuff of the boulevard press. And that's when you stop and think, you know, if he really was such a bohemian and led such a lightweight life, how did he produce this incredibly magisterial and major body of work? You know, so to me, it was a case of dedicating myself. It's an act of homage. That's what this book is to me, really. To go back and look at the artist and the art. You know, not just, you know, of course there are all kinds of funny anecdotes, and he also was an incredibly strange, demanding, intriguing figure, of course. And his life was also a work of art, if you will. But the tragedy, I think, across the arts is that, you know, our public tends to get fascinated by the anecdotes about the life, and that's one more excuse not to look at the art. So this, to me, is a small way of repositioning the importance of the art. Incredibly long answer to a precise and brief question.
That's great, and in fact, I'm going to test your patience here, because I'm going to do exactly what you didn't want to do, which I wanted to personalize a little bit here at this point, which is, would you mind, how many people here met Dom Moraes? Did anyone? One, two? Okay, I also met him a few times. I just wanted to get a sense from you, if you wouldn't mind, just maybe a good way to explore this. Could you track a little bit about what Moraes, you are a very interesting figure. Ranjit, by the way, I should back up here for a second, but Ranjit has been an award-winning poet for more than 2 decades. I mean, he's quite a young man, but nonetheless it's the case. And from the time he's very interesting because he's able to take a perspective on Moraes in kind of a post-colonial, or if you like, a retrospective view, but he was also part of Moraes' scene for some time, right? You were part of the Bombay scene, so you're kind of a bridge figure in an intriguing way between you know, the current generation and the actual practitioners. So do you mind telling us just a little bit about what role did Moraes play in your own life, and also kind of what role he played as a Bombay figure or as a seminal figure on the idol thing in his writing positions we're talking about?
You know, when I was 17 or 18 or 19, Dom already had this great aura around him, of course. It's only when I was writing this book that I realized how young Dom was at that point. Dom had been, you know. It occurred to me that one of the first occasions I met him was actually his 49th birthday, something like that. And of course at that point he seemed incredibly already established, ancient, rock of ages kind of thing. But it's only when I look back that I realized that he wasn't very old. I mean, he was just actually in his early 60s when he died. He had been 74 this year. So it was, you know, it was an encounter with someone who had already lived an incredibly dense and intense life. So when I first met him in 86, and then I met him properly in 87, 88. You know, this is a man who had already gone through an intensive period of international war reportage. He'd spent time in Israel during the 6 Days War, before that covering the Eichmann trial. He'd covered the Algerian Revolution, and that's in the introduction to his very, very cool, almost detached account of a moment when you know, he was in a cafe with someone who was giving him key information, and there was a bomb attack. You know? So the way Dom was able, in his prose, to hold these things at bay and report them in a cool, sort of precise way. And the way in which it fed much more passionately and turbulently into his poetry is something that I find very, very interesting. So when you met him, you were aware that this is the kind of life he led. But it's not that he was, you know, presenting that to his acolytes or his audience in any way. Because he was battling his own demons, actually. And through the 80s, I think just at the point when young poets like me were responding to him as an establishment figure, it's only much later that, you know, I realized that he was wrestling with his own demons of identity, for instance. You know, where exactly did he belong? Where was he in terms of his career? These things were not really stable for him through the late 80s and 90s. It's only a little later that he began to really come to terms with being transcultural at one level, but also dedicating himself to the crises of India in a certain way.
We must hear Ranjit, of course, read some of Tom's poems. I was just asking whether this might be a good time to hear one which touches some of these ideas.
Let me read two. One is called Gondwana Rocks, which is set in Madhya Pradesh, because among the many beautiful prose books that he wrote was also an account of a journey through Madhya Pradesh, spending time in the tribal territories, looking at Gond artists, and following the very hybrid histories of that situation. The book is called Answered by Flutes. I think it's actually been reprinted. Yeah. And again, when I was researching this book, I found it really intriguing how the same experiences would appear in one form in his prose and another form in the poetry. So it was also like looking at the workings of an imagination that could operate at different levels at the same time. It's quite an extraordinary experience to be able to see the work of a writer who was able to just be several different personae. Gondwana Rocks. Heavy, a climbing wind, burdened with coming rain. At the road's edges are black stands of conifer. Above, anarchic rocks, grotesque in disarray, left by a continent which slowly disappeared, scoured and depleted by 100 million rains. They stand in silhouette above the wind-warped pines, more corpsed with memories than ruins which castles leave. Though they have stood much wear, have endured more than grief, and survived more than war, these rocks now bear no runes more than those worked by wind, great shifts of earth and rains. But these gnarled outcrops are connections with what is. The cold salacities of night, days fall and flare, unending cycles pass at the same charted pace. Forest on forest dies at charted pace, beneath the scarred rocks which maintain a stillness not of death. The constant wheel of stars turns over them in time. Glaciers, tidal waves, sandstorms, and human hands have paused on them, then passed. Ghosts follow other ghosts up climbing stairs of wind, across black stands of pine, to the last source of loss, the rocks, the coming rain. He also had an incredible sensitivity to nature, considering that he really was a city boy and he was always a very metropolitan figure. But he had this ability to immerse himself in the experience of the natural world as well. So maybe I'll just read one called Landscapes, which is dedicated to the painter Jahangir Sabharwala. It's strange how Dom and Jahangir knew one another for decades, and each had a similar history. Because like Dom, Jahangir also went away as a child and partly grew up in Europe, trained in London and Paris. But unlike Dom, Jahangir's project was really to come back and entrench himself in an Indian situation and try and develop an artistic vocabulary that had some kind of relationship to the audience. So they had similar histories, similar backgrounds, similar dilemmas, but opted for different cultural, so they made different choices in terms of how to respond to a culture in which they were both insiders and outsiders. So this is for Jahangir Sabharwala, landscapes. These landscapes have the color of absence. Endless departures have been made from them, are being made, will in future be made. These landscapes keep endlessly departing, from ours to a time beyond ours, to arrive without luggage or passports, but themselves tranquil, demanding no favors, bringing their own suns, their own weather. Remote suns, changing weather, odors of impending darkness, wing beats heard on the canvas. What is flying there? Will a great bird descend to tear and rend? Amnesties hang in the air, and no answers save the sound of the colors of absence.
Thank you, Ranjit. Ranjit, I'm struck. One thing that struck me, I'm so glad you chose that one, because it actually, one of the interesting things about this book, I've read this book of yours in a 7 or 8 month period, in which I've also read your Lull Date book, which was released here. Ranjit has released a marvelous book of translations, a 20-year labor of translations by this amazing Sufi poet of Kashmir. He's translated from Kashmir and done a magnificent introduction. It's the poems of Lull Date, and also the book that he's releasing tomorrow, Confluences. And also, last year, Ranjit was the curator of the first Indian pavilion at the Biennale, at the Venice Biennale. Now, all these projects may seem disparate, but actually, perhaps only because I'm looking at them closely, but not really. I think that there are actually some connections, some lines, and I think this idea of transculturality is clearly becoming a kind of a prevailing concern of yours, and it's very interesting the way they connect. But I'm particularly touched by this thing, which is the connection between Sabharwala and Moraes, which it seems you also share, because you spend so much of your time actually repositioning Sabharwala also, right? Ranjit has written not one but 2 books on Jahangir Sabharwala, the great artist of Bombay. And he's also now done this book on Moraes. Earlier today I was talking with our mutual friend, long-term friend again from decades, Naresh Fernandez. And Naresh told me something, he has a feeling, I'm not going to quote him exactly, don't hold him to it, but he gets the feeling that part of your project here, in a way that you have been seeking out, or not seeking out, or reacting well, connecting with quote-unquote people who are kind of mirror images in different ways, which also mirror your own kind of life and preoccupation. Is there something to I'm sorry, it's a very deep and complicated question.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate reading. Because I'm attracted to 2 or 3 major cultural conditions. One of them is hybridity, trans-locality again. And these sound like heavy-duty academic phrases that fall clunkily down, but to me they're just profoundly existential experiences from as long back as I can remember. Because, it's almost banal, but when as a child I was asked this great Indian question, which Indians is quite happy to ask questions bluntly. What are you? And as I grew up, I said, don't ask me that question, because you're likely to get a long lecture about a diasporic community, because there's no simple answer. Because one of the great achievements of the Indian Republic is to create these ethnic divisions where you have to sit in your linguistic and regional box, forgetting that those linguistic and regional identities were also invented and are actually quite mobile. So even as a child, I have to say there is no single answer, because I belong to this ethnic group which has migrated over the last 1,000 years. And then you give accurate dates, and Indians were very happy with talking about their 5,000-year history. Are very surprised to hear that something that happened in 1532 is very real to you. That's exactly what happened. That's when my people left here, for instance. Or then you tell them that they left Kashmir in 1350, and again this surprise, how can can this be? So to me, this fact of nomadism, of diaspora, of hybridity, of transcultural belonging has been a real existential part of my being. And also, because this family past connects me to Kashmir and Goa, where people do not really sit quietly in a single linguistic or religious box, there's also been a complete inability to understand religious fanaticism. So to me, the condition of being liminal between religions, cultures, and philosophies is also something I actually inherit. And so that kind of predisposes me towards people who are in similar situations. So you're right, I mean, whether it's Jahangir or Dom, they were very much figures like this, people with either a diasporic past or a liminal sense of living in a threshold, or in what Homi Bhabha calls a space of in-betweenness. So I suppose in my case it was just fortunate that my particular existential concerns, which were visceral and experiential, also connected with a certain way of doing theory. So I don't have to reach far beyond myself to adopt a theoretical position which is transcultural. It is, to me, the natural situation. Yeah, it is, yeah. So Confluences again came out of that same project. I guess we can talk about this tomorrow. But it came out of conversations with a Bulgarian-German friend who was born in Bulgaria, but his parents escaped the communist dictatorship, so he grew up in Italy and Germany, but also Kenya. So again, we found we had exactly the same attitude to the world, great skepticism about extremisms of belonging. So, this is something that fascinates me, and again, Venice too was about the same set of preoccupations. I mean, what was the Biennale project? I mean, you're given a national pavilion where you have to bear witness to a nation in some sense. And if there's anything one can say with certainty about the Indian nation, it is that it's a work in progress. It is a site of contradictions and paradoxes. So it struck me that the best thing to do with this Indian pavilion was to make it the site where these paradoxes could be dramatized. So I had Zarina Hashmi, who incarnates the crisis of the partition, and who was diasporic. She's lived in New York for 30 years, and is printmaker. Then there was the Desire Machine Collective, which is based in Guwahati. So it's a very sophisticated art-making collective, which also does social projects in a militarized zone. So that too is a facet of being in India, or being Indian today. Or Praneet Soy, who lives between Amsterdam and Calcutta. And if he works on the biennial circuit at one level, he also works with potters in Komortali. So that's another complex way of being an Indian artist. And then there was Gigi Scaria. Gigi Scaria, who was a Keralite living in Delhi and incarnated all the crises of being an internal migrant. So I think, when one is looking at how we all bear witness to contemporary culture, it's through these crises and these inabilities to define clearly that we grow. Those are the nodes of growth. So again, to come back to Dom, I think all of this poetry was a way of rehearsing, revisiting, and opening up these questions for himself. Because also, even in ethnic terms, I talk about this in the introduction. He was Goan on his father's side, but he was East Indian on his mother's side. So again, there was this question of a non-simple identity. And there were a set of, I wouldn't say contradictions, but there were complexities that he was negotiating as he grew up.
In one of your interviews, you had this a line where you talked about a similarity between yourself and Dom, which kind of picks up from what you were talking about now. You said that both you and he share an attitude where you are both critical of the nation state as a constrictive entity. It's basically what we're talking about now. There's also a major preoccupation for Goa, obviously, right? Because it's generally when you make a stereotype, or whenever you try to paint what India is in broad strokes, and always leaves go out, whenever included. So is this kind of a crucial? Is this a crucial part of your whole project here?
It is actually. And this again is something that has fascinated me over a long period and becomes clearer and clearer. Because when you are, as many of us are, and certainly I think you and I both are, when you're at a kind of tangent to the well-established master narratives of nationalism, for instance, then you see the whole thing in a different way. And over the years, when you speak to friends from Manipur or speak to friends from Kashmir, or even in a certain period when I was speaking to Sikh friends, you can see that the Republic, whilst theoretically inclusive, is actually not inclusive at all. There are many, many narratives that have no place in the story of post-colonial India. I mean, the history of post-colonial India is premised on what happened in British India, for the most part. And so the key narrative is the narrative of the Gandhian struggle. This also happens when I talk to Dalit colleagues, Ambedkarites. Again, they feel that their narrative there's no place for it. So what you're looking at is the narrative of a nation which is abstract, and it depends on a certain driver. It has to do with this notion of how British India produced a machine of oppression and how it was overturned in some way. But what does this have to do with what happened in Goa, or in Pondicherry, or in Sikkim, or in Kashmir? I mean, there are very different dramas of development in these places. I mean, I don't have to tell you what happened here. It's obvious that the encounter with the Enlightenment, the encounter with modernity, the encounter with print, the development of a public sphere, the fact of having been citizens of a republic at a point in the early 20th century when British India was still a colony. I mean, these are significant psychic and political facts which don't happen. I mean, they're not represented in the history of India. So it's important to draw out these other narratives. So instead of just mouthing these platitudes about the territorial unity and integrity, etc., etc., you need to accept the fact that there are many narratives here which need to be told in a different way. I mean, there is a way of, for instance, looking at what are called subnational aspirations in the Northeast. You realize that some of these people have developed a liberal discourse, a constitutional discourse, and that was actually wiped out by the Republic. So this strikes us as a contradiction, but it needs to be faced. But also the aspirations for an independent Sikh state. There is an Akali discourse, which again, of course, post the events of 1984 is unvisitable in popular discourse. But the fact is, if you're looking at it with the eye of a historian, you need to accept that there were different aspirations, which were not all identical.
I think that's an excellent point. One culture which I look at quite a lot is Meghalaya and Khasis, and they have a very complicated discourse going on, which is liberal cause and all, and it's completely misunderstood and misrepresented to the extent it's looked at all from outside India. What I liked about, one of the really intriguing and most, if you like, impressive things to me in this book is not just that Moraes, as we know, is born a little like us, perhaps not exactly to the big narratives of Indian history, but what I like what you did with Moraes is not only that you pose him as a kind of an oppositional or contradictory figure, but that you appeal to us to recognize the consistent internal logic in his own thoughts and things. And that is something truly impressive, because what he does is, I mean, this is something that's not done in India. Exactly, it completely falls out of the traditional way of treating any character like this. So what Ranjit, I think Anjum also points this out in her essay about this, but Ranjit insists that we recognize a worldview, and that worldview is Moraes' consistent worldview, and it's a very impressive project because he brings together something in a way that's never been done before. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What is that worldview also, if you wouldn't mind?
That is, it's difficult to define in a kind of succinct way, and that's one of the ways in which he operates. I think his views as, if you will, a citizen are clear, and those can be encompassed in a certain way. It's a kind of for lack of another description, a liberal, skeptical, humanist attitude. But what goes on in his poetry, which is also a powerful worldview, is something else. It's definable over a period of reading his poetry and seeing the recurrences. So that's, in one sense, the reason to annotate the poetry is to demonstrate how that worldview actually developed, what it says about his understanding of the human subject, his understanding of time as a process not guided by redemption at all, but as an essentially attritive, destructive process. But by contrast, the human condition is defined as the condition of simply articulating this bearing witness, sharing the predicaments of others in similar conditions. So, in many ways, profoundly the opposite of the image you have of Don. Because Don has often been described as this inward-looking, narcissistic figure with very little sense of affect for what went on elsewhere. But if you look at the poetry, it's completely the opposite view. He actually had an amazing ability to respond, whether it was to the victims of civil war in West Africa, or whether it was to the people he met in the course of his reportage in Vietnam, or in Suharto's Indonesia. And all of that leaks back into the poetry. So, in a strange way, it's the worldview of someone who would rather not be compassionate, but whose experiences lead him to conditions of empathy.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd read some more at this point, but I want to quickly follow up that question. I also want to bring up some Goa stuff with Moraes, obviously, as you should. This worldview that you described, and certainly in this introduction, it's a very novel approach to Moraes, right? This transculturality being the center of it. But I do get the impression in this introduction, to some extent, that Ranjit is saying that Moraes is sui generis. You know, he's a little, maybe I'm getting that impression, maybe I'm not. Maybe it's a misplaced. But it does occur to me, this is something also that I came across in Anjun's review, is that to me, a person, someone like Moraes, he does have spiritual doppelgangers in a way. Not doppelgangers, but I do see some strong parallels, for instance, in different periods of his life with Francis Newton Sousa, for instance. I think, and they're connected, and they were connected. Sousa, I must tell you, as a personal anecdote, Sousa boasted to me once every 2 months that he got Moraes to give up his Indian passport over Goa, which actually is an exaggeration. It's not exactly what happened, but once every 2 months, Sousa said, I did it. So he has this connection to him. But also I think that there are these strong resonances with people like Nissim Ezekiel. And perhaps also Sabawala, Keith Patel, who may not have been very close friends with him. Perhaps I've heard that they were, I don't know, but Keith Patel also strikes me as being a kind of a person who can be very usefully, Adil Jasawala. These are major figures who actually can be placed in a continuum with Moraes. Do you think that's the case, or is he more or less a singular figure?
That's really not the impression that I wanted to give, that he was sui generis, because that's, it's also it's partly a formal constraint, because as an introduction to a selected edition like this, you tend to focus on the individual you're talking about. So in that sense, it's what Joseph Campbell would have called the journey of the hero, the quester. So that's the form the narrative might take. But I've tried in various ways to contextualize. I begin in fact by marking him off alongside Nissim, Adil and Ramanujan. Adil Jasawala, A.K. Ramanujan and Nissim Ezekiel. And also pointing out the similarities in their careers. Also because they began publishing in the 50s and 60s as Anglophone Indians, but also people who were responding to the cultural and political transformation of their country, but who were also playing a certain role in a larger Cold War politics. Because I think we usually tend to, opt for banalities like East versus West, the UK or India, things like that. We tend to forget that those choices were also overdetermined by the larger Cold War politics. And whether it was Nissim, who was editor of Quest, which effectively was the CIA front, or Don working for the United Nations, or Adil being part of a Marxist youth organization which resisted what they would regard as imperial mechanisms, or Ramanujan working in American academia in an area studies program that had the blessings of the State Department. But being aware of that, and how did these poets work, I mean, do their creative work, do their academic work, and also remain intensely aware of the politics of their context. And these are things I've alluded to, but that would need another kind of study, which I hope to get onto at some point, because there's a whole archive of notes coming out of this project, which will find articulation elsewhere. Yeah, but again, as I say, so I didn't want to suggest that Dom was in any sense totally sui generis. Of course, there's something unique to his particular career and development, as would be true of any of the others. You know? Also, I think what I also wanted to do was to sketch out the social and cultural histories from which he emerged. So, you know, I've tried to situate him, again, it's at the level of the footnote, but it's kind of fairly amplified footnotes, in terms of, say, the Goan diaspora in Bombay. This is through the Moraes and Furtado backgrounds. Or in terms of his mother's side of the family, the East Indians, their particular negotiations with first the Portuguese Empire and then the British. So what were the advantages and the deficits and the inheritances? These are very important questions, although Dom tended typically to be very eccentric and offhand about these things. The fact that he developed as a certain kind of figure has to do with the work of 3 or 4 generations that preceded him. And the impress of that is very, very strong in his personality and the work. Even his ultimately sort of crusading sense of taking on the right-wing establishment as he saw it in the 90s, in the last decade of his life, you know, that draws on his father's work. And there was a point when the young Dom told his father, I'm never going to do your kind of journalism. But it's incredible that eventually that's just the kind of writing he moved towards. And then as I went into his life, I realized that that was not recent. It goes back to the late 60s when he suddenly became aware of the fact that he really was an immigrant in the UK. So he goes out to all of these benighted places, you know, in the middle UK, so to speak, and talks to immigrants, bears testimony to what was going on there and so on. So and some of that goes back to the kinds of social awareness that you find in his background in the Goan diaspora.
I actually completely agree with Ranjit. That's one of the things that Ranjit has done here, which is of great value to us in terms of cultural history, is that you know, Dom Moraes was an interesting person. He's a myth maker himself, right? He continually made up stories. Like Sousa also continually made up stories about himself, about his own life, and those stories then became enshrined and then became in our history books. Almost half of what we read about Sousa is a made-up story by himself that he projected, for instance. And Dom Moraes did this a lot. One of the really impressive things that Ranjit does here is he doesn't take Dom Moraes at his own word about his own life, which is something required about with many of our own artists, is that he goes and checks with Dom's auntie and Dom's notes and what people wrote at the time, and he challenges Dom's own account of himself and what Dom said about himself, which is really, it's a highly impressive and I must say deeply persuasive. Your account of Dom's life is quite more persuasive than his own account, really, because his own part clearly, you know, glosses over so many things. If you read his autobiography, by the way, is one of the finest works of Indian prose, but you know, it's I think it needs to be read in the context of Ranjit's introduction. I wanted to ask you about this just before we perhaps read some more, and I also wanted to bring up a little bit. Where does this audacity, what possesses you, Ranjit, to challenge people's own stories about themselves? Is it required? Is it a requirement? Do you think it's necessary, or is it just is it a necessary? I think it's deeply necessary historically. But what possessed you? It's contrary to kind of the Indian impulse to challenge these hagiographic stories that people spread about themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is just a fact of training. I mean, if you're going to write something in the spirit of a historian, then you just do it in the spirit of a historian, as simple as that. Because in any case, we have far too much hagiography, and things become folkloric, and you know, they have an importance as folklore. It's it's amusing, it keeps alive the spirit of a person. But if you're going to write any form of historical account, it needs to be contextualized, I mean, if you want to call it that, not verified for fact, but really to get a sense of why Dom might have produced that kind of narrative, for instance, and what was the reality of those events, and what is the difference between the narrative and the actuality tells. So, also just a sense that, you know, as these events disappear from consciousness, we need to be able to bear testimony to what might actually have happened. And in the process, it just enriches your sense of how, in this case, Dom actually operated. Because throughout this time when he was doing his reportage on the immigrants between 68 and 70 in the UK, you know, I discovered that he worked closely with Deepak Nandi, who was a Marxist literary critic, is a Marxist literary critic, but was also an anti-fascist and a member of the Communist Party. So, you know, on the face of it, it seems completely unlikely. What links the lyrical bohemian Moraes with Deepak Nandi? Then you realize that they actually worked pretty closely together and took an interest in one another's work. And it just amplifies your sense of your protagonist. So there's much more to the life than seems visible or has been discussed. For instance, and there are many other examples. All of his wonderful friendships with Israeli poets, for instance, and artists.
Yes.
And that opens up a whole new vista.
Absolutely, I've always felt that's a hidden, very important cultural link. Moraes had this profound connection to Israel, which went back and forth, and they went back and forth actually, and they were also subterranean political connection with Moraes helped to, I mean, for instance, Moshe Dayan, trips here and so on, so my grandfather's poems. I would like to, there's a wonderful poem by Dom Moraes where he mentions a little bit about this episode of 1961, where he kind of emotionally became involved with the liberation issue, and I'd like to read you, with Ranjit's permission, I'd like to read it because there's a wonderful story which to me says a lot about Goa, says a lot about Moraes, and I'd quickly read it to you. It's excerpted in this book which I and some of us did last year called Libertação, which was printed to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Goa's liberation. So I'll just read a brief bit to you, and then perhaps Ranjit, you might want to, would you mind reading that poem, or is it too long? Okay. There's a poem in which he mentions it, but here's what he prefaces this by saying, he was in England, Sousa was also in England. Towards the end of that year, 1961, there were rumbles in the English press about what was happening off the western coast of India. They evoked some echoes in me. Since Goa, the place in question, had been the home of my forefathers. He also introduces a word here which I've used shamelessly ever since then. He says it had originally consisted of a chain of riparian islands. Lovely word, riparian. But now it's been trademarked by me. So what happens is Moraes basically, well, I'll read a little bit more. A number of expatriate Goans in London, including the painter Francis Newton Sousa, talked to me about the matter before the Indian invasion or liberation or whatever. A newspaper suggested to him that he should fly to India. But he was alienated from India because of his mother, so he turned down the newspaper offer. But then he wrote a long piece, in which he said, among other things, that since Nehru had refused the plebiscite and forced the issue, making Goans Indians without consulting them, I was ashamed to be Indian, said Moraes. I was wholly unprepared for the reaction both in England and India. The English press supported me wholeheartedly, but the Indian press tore me to pieces. An effigy of me was burnt in public in Bombay. The Indian High Commission protested, and then his father calls him and says, look, they're going to take away your passport. His father's good friend of Nehru. Nehru had called him and said, what is your boy doing? The father said, you're going to lose your passport. You know, they're going to take away your citizenship. So what Moraes does, he goes to the British consulate, where he had a friend, and he gives up his passport and gets a British passport. This is seen, particularly in Goa, as a flamboyant gesture. Moraes has given up his passport in protest. He wanted a jackfruit, right? And his father was a sophisticated man, but Moraes was so shocked that he actually wanted to eat rather than drink anything. He says, I'm going to go and I'm going to get you these things. So he comes to Goa, okay? Now here's the funny story. He goes to Mandovi Hotel. I'm sure you're familiar with this. So So we had come in more or less unannounced, and on the first night in the Mandovi Hotel, I went, as was my wont, to the bar, right? Moraes, the famous drinker. It was very crowded, and I shared a table with a man who presently asked me my name. I was hoping that man would be here today. He's Chico Fernandez from Banjo. So this man asked him his name. I told him my surname, Moraes, which is how Ranjit and Nandini were pronouncing it. It's more an anglicized way of pronouncing it. How do you spell it? So I spelled it as I pronounced it, Moraes, M-O-R-R-A-Y-S. But when I spelled it, my companion, Chico Fernandez, cried out, Moraes! Yes, man, you come from the village of Santa Cruz, and your father has land there. But you have a funny voice, you don't sound Goan. What is your first name? When I told him, I said, Don Moraes. Don Moraes, he said, you are the man who tried to save us from the Hindus. Man, you are a hero. He leapt to his feet and brought the crowded bar to silence by waving his arms and shouting, here is our hero, here is Don Moraes. I returned very late to my room then. So, this is Dom. You know, Dom famously distanced himself from his family, scathing about his relatives. To the extent he writes about his roots, very often he tends to be dismissive, shall we say, at the best. Yet this anecdote indicates something completely different, and every Goenka here, I can tell you, is going to have a slightly different view of Moraes, So what does this say about Dom? What does it say about his real identities, his kind of the way he was out of the sleeve?
To say, because his views really were not constant or uniform, kept changing over. But what this episode certainly tells you about is that he was, you know, quite delighted with that turn of events.
Yes.
He was, yes. But also I think at some level it was an external validation of something, of a state, of a stance he had taken. That would be my guess. And also it's one of the few times in his life where he really actually talks about his connections to Goa. Because otherwise, the deep and abiding connections, I think, were really Britain, which remained an obsession. Israel, in a strange way. And then there was a very vexed relationship with Bombay. So my sense was always that Goa to him was something that was absorbed into his relationship with Bombay. And outside of that, it tended to be a more political sort of connection. Although he did, I mean, he wrote several books. I mean, several of his prose works have to do with Goa.
And a lot of journalism, actually. He has several journalistic pieces about Goa. Repeatedly mentioned Chico Fernandez's other close friends, by the way, were Lucio Miranda and Mario Miranda, who are no longer. What is Dom's significance to Goa? Is there significance? Does Dom have a significance to Goa?
Tough to say. I think in the general sense that, you know, I think it's interesting to see him as part of the expanded Goan narrative, if you will. And that's Susa, you know. Yeah. I think there's a way in which, when people live away from the core, if you will, culture, civilization, or region, they actually tend to refract some of the great themes and questions. I think so. Whether it's Susa or Dom, or several other figures that I can think of really like that. I think the themes and questions that would preoccupy the Goan consciousness tend to get refracted differently. So I think belonging and direction and orientation would be important themes.
Is there something you'd like to read that might touch on this? Or anything? And then maybe we should throw it over.
Yeah, maybe I'll read a slightly longer, but what in relation to these questions of, you know, where does one belong and how does one direct one's life, Dom also tended to work through what he called masks. You know, he'd play Sinbad the sailor, or Jason, or Barber, and the story of his life would be refracted in a certain way through these other personae. So let me just, maybe I'll finish my part of this by reading this poem, Barber. It takes the form of Barber speaking to his scribe, who's called Tingri Birdi. By night, Tingri Birdi The hills burnt in loops and whirls of twined fire. Arabesques of fire in the forest, and in the valleys, pools of fire. Over and under me, liquid fire poured itself into all crevices, reddened the rocks, the fox's earth, embered nests were empty, the birds departed. The tribesmen did this in peace, etching their fields from the ash left. I know war, but no taken town, spired in flames, ever seized my eye, tinker building, like that land on fire. Those forests, stroked by the purest element, were turned to ashes to make life. I have made ashes, but for death. Miles from that place we camped, reeds and a river. Mosquitoes came at nightfall with the lamps, the opium confection, then wine. I heard music and I slept, pyramids of heads on my pillow, soundless flames around my flesh, faces, whispers, omens, the dead in the dust, familiars of the field, vultures allayed as angels on each corpse. One, in that sleeping, seemed my son. With a great cry, I drove them away, awoke weeping, ate opium confection, drowsy afterwards, saw myself as I am, lonely in all lands. Now on the way to another war, I have seated myself beside the river. Far from sweet melons and the snow, I arrange these words for you, Tingribirdi. I have little time left for words. My hard men fasten their helmets. The ponies whinny in their hobbles. Drums for departure scare the crows. Grey burnish shows in a crow's feathers. As though he first meant to make a dove, I wrought words before I fought wars. Steel in those words like swords hurt me also. My books are where I bleed, as when they drove me out to the badlands, wifeless, to echo the cry of the wolf. Then betrayals by friends, the death of friends. In the flames, always with me, I will not burn. Like a plainsman's ox, I return to the yoke of these years, who was healer and killer in the hills. If you look for me, I am not here. My writings will tell you where I am. Tingribirdi, they point out my life like lines drawn in the map of my arm.
It seems that there's a curious anomaly with poetry, particularly English writing, Indian poetry in English, in that the novelists of the same period and now the contemporary artists of the same period have achieved global notoriety and are considered significant, but yet the poets, who seem to me to be every inch as outstanding and qualified, are getting there only very slowly. Kolatkar is only now started to be spoken of in the terms of, as a major modernist poet. He is, and almost all the others are still languishing way behind. Why is it? Is it entirely because of lacuna of criticism? Is it because we lack good criticism in poetry? Or what is it? What explains it?
Difficult to say. I haven't really thought about it very carefully, but I think partly it's because poetry in general seems to be, seems to have been pushed into a corner, partly by itself, partly by the absence of a larger readership. So it doesn't occupy the same sort of stage as contemporary art or contemporary novel do. So that is a problem. But I wonder if it's also because we've developed a discourse that tends to be inward-looking and preoccupied with self-justification in a national scheme of things. So I don't know if that's been a problem, and things may well change, because now, to hark back to this beloved trope of transculturality, I think many poets, whether they're based here or elsewhere, people of Indian origin tend to work in a transcultural space. So they may well open up in diverse ways and beyond the forms of publishing that we are now familiar with. So what might develop in, say, the digital space in the next decade is difficult to predict.
I think it's a good time to ask for questions from the audience.
That is the hardest task of all. Maybe leave it to the end of my comment, because I don't want the comment be prejudged. But let me go with the chair. My name is Ranjit, and I have dabbled in history, shall we say. I don't have a question really, but I just wanted to make a comment about the concern that many of us exhibit with great anguish sometimes about how we are overcome by the compulsions of the master narrative and thereby lose a lot of the local inflections, be it of poetry or history. I don't need to give scholastic references to this, but I'm sure that my comments will resonate with what's in your mind in terms of a historiographic awareness of these issues in contemporary literature. While I was listening to the extremely interesting and thought-provoking disquisition of Moraes as well as your own interpretations, it struck me that if we are with such great feeling and acuity going to apply the question of the eventual refracting function in the poet's mind of the smaller locale, in this case in its manifestation goal, but we don't necessarily have to underline that. Let us not forget the master narrative was not received by us. That it too was something which in the process of the discourse of history was created through many contrary, seemingly contradictory refractions. And that would put a completely different spin on the fact that there are these two necessarily opposed points of tension between the master narrative and the location of the poet. Thank you very much.
Certain alternative histories, histories that have now dropped out of sight, debates and questions and crises and dilemmas which are not on the agenda anymore. Also, there's another friend and colleague of ours, Mustam Sirdalbi, who's just translated a new translation of Iqbal's Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa. And there again you have this, in the process of discussing this with him and over a series of public conversations, we were also looking at the ways in which the lively and profound debates about where India was meant to go in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, it's dropped out of sight. I mean, we remember one or two or maybe three figures from that debate, but there are many others, other contributors to that debate with very different perspectives who've been erased. So there's a need to retrieve these alternative visions, not necessarily to re-enshrine or reinstall them, but just to get a real measure of the discussions that have produced this contemporary Indian subjectivity. I mean, I think the problem, and we're not that far away from Independence Day, so in the neighborhood of Independence Day, maybe it's a good occasion to talk about these things. There's no room for complacency. We need to constantly revisit the urgencies and the open questions that inform this post-colonial condition of ours. So that's my concern in all of these projects that we've been discussing. We shouldn't foreclose too quickly on what it means to be contemporary Indians. I think if there's anything that gives meaning and urgency to that condition, it's the dilemmas and the questions and the lost histories.
Just to add to that, the significance of this Goa, as you were saying, cannot be underestimated, because I mean the story of modernism, exactly what Ranjit is talking about. The complexity of the debate itself has been forgotten, and a simple kind of reductionist bottom line is imposed as the story. And this, one of the things that we've been working on in Goa is modernism, right? Trying to provide an alternate. It's very obvious to anyone who looks at the art that they are competing strands, not competing, but complementary strands to the development of modern Indian art, to use a very simple formulation, right? That there was something that took place in Calcutta, and up to 1947, it was understood that there were two schools, and there were two ways, two approaches to it. Since 1947, that one entire part of the story has been forgotten. In fact, erased in a way, and we are told now, the canonical books come out, in which the entire competing kind of a story, which was taken as for granted up to 1947, is completely erased. So this is the importance of the kind of work that Ranjit is doing, and I think this is the significance of it for here in Goa particularly. I also recommend very, very strongly, by the way, please look it up on the internet, Ranjit's essay that he wrote for Aparanta, which starts to explore some of these themes, I think, particularly of confluence. It's called Mapping the Invisible River. It's easily available on the internet. Some more questions?
I did want to reiterate, without sounding abstractist, the point that everything that has been said a few moments ago is most welcome and well taken. My point was simply that in the same way as the master narrative, with only the dual dimension to it which got over-concretized, master narrative got reified, this tension ought not also to get reified. That's my only point. And as to Goa, to your point, if I may give it, there are dimensions with very serious implications all the way. This has nothing to do with the multi-stranded nature of the experienced history as well as the received histories. That is to say, the early 20th century formation of the identity of the Goan citizen as a part of the Portuguese project. But it has something to do with the fact that the ambivalence with regard to other populations in the state that we constantly see reverberating in its many echoes in the newspapers, and which eventually gets codified in the legalistic mind of the dominant profession in the state in terms of special privileges for Goa, or what's the word? I forget the phrase. Beg your pardon?
Special status.
Special status, yes. Special status is in fact not just an issue of special status alone. It is so much more. And that's why I was a little hesitant when I said that in relation to my question, maybe I do not simply want to underline the empirical instance of Goa, because that is a subject for an alternative discussion. Thank you.
I knew Dom because he was a great friend of my late husband, and he, Leela, and Nirmal were great drinking partners, I would say, and would come often to our place, or we would go to Leela's place near the Causeway where she was living. Nirmal reviewed a couple of his books, the last one being on Madhya Pradesh, Answered with Fruits, and he wasn't much of a talker, I would say that. But to meet at our place or at Vinod Mehta's place or the Tower.
Essential figures. And replaced, I must say, in a very lovely way in our culture, like by a new generation of Konkani stalwarts like Ranjit and Abhay and Naresh and Jerry, all friends of ours. So this is also this living connection, which actually was, I think, there's a lovely phrase that Ranjit has, which he refers to, I think, substantial material connection. Is that I think that would be my last question to you before we go back to that. Dom, what does it represent in the life of the city? Because we're very lucky and privileged to have this event here, but in a way we are stealing Bombay's thunder, because Dom, if he belonged to any place, really is a Bombay creation, a Bombay person, if he did, right? What is Dom's significance in
very much as a member of this phalanx of figures that you named. Also from the point of view of incarnating the dilemmas of the city, or if you will, the city's cultural scene. But I also wonder if there was a way in which his transition from being a somewhat inward-looking, aloof observer to being someone who then, in the last 5 years of his life, addressed the larger crises of India, that marked a certain shift in the perspective of I wonder, but having said that, that might just have been Dom's particular move to amplifying his consciousness. And we think of, say, Charles Correa. I mean, he begins with that wide national canvas and is really part of the narrative of national modernity in a way that Dom was not for a long time. So again, it's not, I don't know if Dom exemplifies a larger direction so much as he marks one direction within this phalanx. Some of them began with a larger national view, participated and contributed to it, and then kind of drew back to the city. In Dom's case, I think it was the other way. Seeing himself as part of a certain kind of city, even, which was changing around him, to being the kind of person who could then go out and deal with, say, the Gujarat genocide, or with the situation of tribals in Madhya Pradesh, or then to go down to the south, or to look at the Buddhist Ambedkarite upsurge. I mean, these were, just to name 4 things that he became very interested in the last few years of his life. So there was a sudden, unbelievable actually, I wouldn't say an identification with India, but a certain engagement, a critical, visceral engagement with where he was, with his site and his predicament.
Yeah, just so, I don't know if anyone knows this, just to track this, towards the end of Dom's life, he left Leela Naidu, left their home, which they had shared for decades, and moved to Bandra, and lived with a young journalist that he married, Srivats, sorry. And they wrote quite a number of things together, with all these engagements with India in a completely different mode, a different Dom, where he was really, as Ranjit is saying, took on some of the social problems in India in a very personal way, in a way that was completely unthinkable, I think, for the 20-year-old Dom, or the 25-year-old Dom. We must ask Ranjit to read one more before you, if you'd be kind enough, Ranjit, but let's ask for couple more questions, or any more questions. This has been a lovely event, and we're all very grateful to Ranjit for doing it. And tomorrow I urge you all to come again, where we'll have I predict a scintillating conversation between another of the really fine minds of India, of our times, Mr. Sudhir Kankar, world-renowned psychoanalyst and writer, who also has a strong kind of connection to Germany and this transcultural kind of approach. And so I think they're discussing an absolutely fantastic book called Confluences, which I highly recommend. It's really one of the finest little polemical works I've read in some years. I very much like it. I have given many copies away to my brother and to all Indians I know abroad who should be reading it. But some more questions, please, any more questions before we let Ranjit read and go? Yes, please, Bhai.
What do you think? Dom Moraes is happily smiling at its election that you have done?
I like to think he might be pleased by it. Yeah, tough to say. I think that he might have probably approved. He may have, I suspect he'd have been happier if there were more poems from the later period. But in the nature of a selection, ideally one would not want to leave anything out. It's part of the privilege and the disaster of being an anthologist of any kind. That you can make a certain selection, but then it stands on a certain ground of judgment. So for me, this is the essential Moraes because it prunes away, for instance, a lot of what I see to be his lyrical excesses, the romantic sort of posturing of the very young poet, and also what I see sometimes to be the sentimental excesses of the later period. So there's you draw out a certain shape of a career, and the argument is not that this is the only thing worth having, but that this is something that can be presented as a shape of a life. This is a poem that he actually wrote well, it was written as a reply to a letter he got from his son, who he hadn't heard from for a very long time. This was a son left by his second wife, Judith. There'd been a period of over 15 years where they hadn't been very much contact. And then Hef wrote to ask, to say that he didn't have much of a sense of the Indian side of the family, and could Dom tell him more, and so on. So Dom suddenly realized that he was in this very strange position of someone who'd written a memoir called My Son's Father, but whose actual contact with his son was minimal. So that's something that went into it. So this is the poem he wrote for his son. It's called Key. And the title is the first word of the poem. Key, crowned in the Victorian lock, stiff, with difficulty screwed open, to admit me to the 7 mossed stairs and the badly kept garden. Who runs to me in memory through flowers destroyed by no love, but the child with brown hair and eyes smudged all over with toffee? I lick his cheeks, I bounce him in air. 2 bounces, he disappears. 15 years later, he redescends, not as a postponed child, but a letter asking me for his father, who now possesses no garden, no home, not even any key. Thank you for being here.
With difficulties screwed open, I think that is a nice way to end, because that's exactly what Ranjit has done with this very complicated, very important poet, repositioned them for the 21st century and for all of our appreciation. Thank you, Ranjit. Congratulations on this fantastic achievement, and looking forward to it.